as Finance Minister Tito Mboweni prepares to deliver an extraordinary supplementary budget. Many, including ratings agencies, will be watching with keen interest. But how does South Africa's COVID-19 stimulus package compare to its peers and the rest of the world? And for more on this, we're joined by Razia Khan, Chief Economist. Razia, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, as we await the much-anticipated emergency and national budget speech to be announced by the Finance Minister later today, I mean, just to kick-start off this conversation, South Africa announced a 500 billion rand stimulus package, of course, as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some say that this is not a stimulus package and it's not enough. I mean, how do you view it?
Well, South Africa's starting point was, of course, very difficult. Even prior to the COVID-19 crisis, we know from the February budget that Treasury was forecasting a deficit as uncomfortably high as 6.8% of GDP. Now, since then, we expect to have seen significant deterioration in underlying economic activity because of the lockdown period. We know that revenue will be far more significantly impacted than was the case with the initial projections. And on top of that, South Africa somehow has to find the room for a fiscal stimulus. Putting all of this together, there's very limited space to really come up with any very, very significant spending package. And there's going to have to be a very careful balancing act, as we all know, with the reprioritization of spending from other areas.
I mean, no one wants the finance minister's job right now, but just looking at the numbers as we speak, there's the debt to GDP ratio, which is set to breach 100%. I mean, by the year 2024 to 2025, there's also the budget deficit set to climb to 14%. So in view of these figures that have been touted, I mean, how important is the supplementary budget to ratings agencies, especially since South Africa has already been downgraded?
Well, it's all important to still instill that sense of confidence that, one, the growth picture might be able to benefit from structural reforms. Any thinking that South Africa is moving in a more reformist direction could still have a big impact on the country's ability to attract all-important inflows on the ease of the financing of its fiscal deficit. So there are a number of things that offshore investors will be watching very closely, in addition to the headline numbers. Just how bad is the deterioration? How large is the budget deficit? What does it mean for the debt numbers? But also, what are the medium-term plans? How is South Africa planning to reprioritize spending over time? Is it moving in a direction where it will be able to do more for growth? Ultimately, the part of the equation that is all important for that debt to GDP ratio is South Africa's ability to reignite growth at this point.
Just looking at the policies that need to be focused on and some of the adjustments as well as implementation thereof. I mean, what is your take on this?
So this isn't going to be an easy budget at all, as we know, but we also know that these are not normal times. So there had been a lot of spending that had been incorporated in the initial budget, which may not be required necessarily at this point in time. What other adjustments will be closely looked to? In February, there had been substantial pledges in terms of cutting the public sector compensation bill. The belief that South Africa's spending priorities had perhaps been a little misplaced, giving public servants higher than inflation wage increases year after year was not necessarily doing anything for growth. It was not creating that very necessary room for investment. So this is still going to be a key theme of this budget, even as it comes in very unusual, very difficult times. That is, how much space is being created ultimately to drive broader growth to drive prosperity for everyone.
Razia, we're looking at the options that could be explored. I mean, there are institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, there's also the Development Bank, many questioning the feasibility of it. I mean, is it a good or bad idea? What we do with the funds that we're going to be borrowing from these institutions. Many are worried about the borrowing part because we know that what is incurred to date will obviously fall onto the burden of the youth, that obviously have to bear the brunt of the decisions and consequences made. What is your take on this?
So one of the favorable consequences of available in terms of COVID relief and the emergency financing that has been put in place by a number of different multilateral institutions is precisely this. At a time when South Africa is likely to be seeing a record deficit, it does not need to rely on market financing, very expensive market financing alone, to be able to fund that deficit. There is funding available from the IMF, potentially at very concessional rates of interest for a substantial period of time. There is funding available from other multilateral institutions, as we've seen. And South Africa would do well to tap into all potential sources of concessional financing at a time when its own public finances are so stretched.
Razia, I also want to bring in the issue of the zero-based budget approach that, of course, literally will be working on expenditure line by line. In terms of this approach and just perhaps allocating funds to according to the revenue base that is available, I mean, what do you make of this approach going forward? And just looking at the current economic crisis in South Africa, the high job losses and unemployment rate that has currently been announced as well. I mean, what do you think this is going to do to impact the revenue collection for the rest of the year?
Yes, certainly one can't ignore the Q1 unemployment data where even prior to the COVID-related slowdown, even before the substantive imposition of the lockdown, South Africa had already seen an unemployment rate as high as 30%. If that is the starting point, just where does it get to at the peak of the crisis, given the COVID-related impacts on the economy? Now, the question is, should there be an adoption of a zero-based budgeting approach? The idea behind this is, of course, maybe don't start with the assumption that you do what you do every year and that there are set allocations for spending. If you had to start completely afresh, where are the priorities? Where is spending most needed? Where is it going to make the biggest difference to growth? Now, we don't know necessarily that there has been enough time to adopt that approach for this special budget, the adjustment budget. But what we do know is simply the impact of that statement alone has set up an expectation of much more reformist intent, that South Africa will be forced to look much more closely at its spending priorities. And this related crisis is not the time to carry on as usual.
Razia, I mean, there's so much more to unpack as we obviously preempt ahead of the speech by our finance minister later today. There's the issue of the state-owned enterprises and perhaps what the turnaround strategies will also, be with regards to that. But I want to just bring in the issue of technology. Going forward, we can see the technological infrastructure, the digital skills that will be needed. Could this be a catalyst for economic growth, an option we could explore as we rethink and find innovative ways to perhaps stimulate the economy and mitigate against some of the challenges we find ourselves in during these unprecedented times?
Certainly, anything that raises the overall productivity rate of the economy is likely to have great benefits in terms of delivering the growth. So just as there's going to be very careful choices made around what the spending priorities should be, any space that can be created to perhaps push out that technological frontier of the economy, to create more investment in sectors that are going to have a significant impact on future growth, will likely be a good thing. Of course, the starting need to be recognised is that the government's room for input into all of this is very much limited. maybe what we're talking about is just the provision of a conducive environment for private sector investment to be driving this forward.
Razia, the last conclusion does relate to the state of state-owned entities in the country and perhaps the operational capacity to date. Looking at the issues that plague many of these state-owned enterprises, exploring the issues of corruption, leakages, and even wasteful expenditure in some parts of them. I mean, what is your take? How is this going to also impact the ratings agencies and some of the considerations that will have to be taken into by the finance minister today?
Even given the significant governance changes that South Africa has seen in the recent past, and with that, hopefully, the reassurance that SOEs are going to be run differently going forward, there is no getting away from the issue of the substantial debt overhang that remains simply because of the way state-owned enterprises were run in the past. This is a time when it's very much an issue of how quickly can things be put right, given the very, very difficult economic backdrop, but also what to do about the accumulated debt and the government guarantees on that debt. That counts as what we call a contingent liability for government. It still gets in the way of being able to spend freely on other things in the future. It still gets counted by many rating agencies as part, ultimately, of the government's total public debt ratio. So anything that can be done to reduce the scale of those contingent liabilities, to create more confidence that SOEs will be well run in the future and will have less recourse, less need for consistent financing from government, will generally move things in a more positive direction.
Speaking of positive direction, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom, Razia. I just want to get your views on the take of spending on perhaps social relief programs, which, is said to be also a productive means of expenditure because by virtually investing in human capital, it has multiplier effects. And there are also the issues of challenging some of the money towards service delivery and infrastructure, as we heard in the symposium held yesterday by our president. I mean, what is your take on that in conclusion?
There's a very careful balancing act that is needed, but the whole world over, everyone is talking about a post-COVID reset. How do you protect health expenditure? How do you protect the most vulnerable people in this crisis and still create conditions that allow the room for further investment spending for future growth? It is a difficult task, it is a challenge, but it's absolutely something that South Africa has to find a solution to. It is not a choice for anyone to leave behind the very necessary social expenditure, the protection of the most vulnerable. At the same time, that has to be done in a way that still creates the room for investment spending. What does this ultimately mean? That the less necessary aspects of spending really have to go.